This is the First World War in 100 seconds. A brief history of the Great War, or the War to End All Wars as it was also known, in which over 16 million people lost their lives. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo. This event triggered a diplomatic crisis in Europe, leading to a chain reaction that pulled the continent into war. Within a month, the Austrians had declared war on Serbia and began their invasion through Bosnia. Soon, the Russians would jump to the defense of Serbia, while the French and British would commit to supporting them as well. On August 4, 1914, the German Empire would declare war on them, too, having received an ultimatum from the French. On August 13th, the Japanese Empire would enter the conflict on the side of the Allies after the British had secured their colonial possessions. Thus began the deadliest war in human history, fought across the continents, involving more than 70 million combatants and causing unprecedented casualties. But the fighting wasn't even that even. The European powers were evenly matched, but they all had their respective colonies and dependencies to draw resources from. The British, for example, had vast territories all over the world. The French had Algeria, the Germans had their colonial possessions in Africa, and so on. And because of this, much of the fighting took place far from the front lines in Europe. In Asia and Africa, there were battles that often went overlooked, such as the Siege of Tsingtao, where the Germans surrendered their colony of Qingdao in China to the Japanese, or the Battle of the Congo, where the British and the Belgians fought against the Germans in the Congo. But the most famous campaigns were undoubtedly those fought on the European Western Front, with the British and the French against the Germans and their allies, the Austrians. As the war dragged on, each side desperately tried to outmaneuver and defeat the other. The French had some early successes, defeating the Germans at the Battle of the Marne, which ended the Schlieffen Plan and forcing them to retreat. But the Germans would soon counterattack and push the Allies back. This would be the pattern of the war, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. One of the most brutal battles was the Battle of Verdun, in which the Germans attempted to break through the French lines, resulting in hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. Another was the Battle of the Somme, in which the British attacked the Germans with massive artillery barrages, followed by infantry charges, also resulting in hundreds of thousands of casualties. Throughout the war, new technologies were developed and deployed, such as tanks, poison gas, armored cars, airplanes, submarines, and more. These innovations resulted in unprecedented levels of destruction and death, changing the nature of warfare forever. By 1917, the war had become a stalemate. The French, British and Russians were exhausted, and the Germans were unable to achieve a decisive victory. At this point, the United States would enter the conflict after the Germans had sunk a ship carrying American passengers in the Atlantic Ocean. This outraged the American public, who pressured their government to intervene in the conflict. The Americans joined the Western Front, bolstering the exhausted Allies and helping them turn the tide of war. In Russia, the situation was much different. In February 1917, a revolution had broken out, overthrowing the Tsar and establishing a provisional government. This government continued Russia's involvement in the war until October, when a second revolution occurred, this time bringing the country under the control of Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik party. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed on March 3, 1918, in which Russia withdrew from the war and ceded vast territories to the Central Powers. This effectively removed Russia from the conflict and allowed Germany to focus its forces on the Western Front. But by this point, the Germans were exhausted and the war was already being lost. In November 1918, the Armistice of November was signed, ending hostilities between the combatants. The war was over. When news broke out that the armistice had been signed, people across the world celebrated. They had endured years of hardship, death, and destruction, and now it was finally over. But the peace that followed was not to last. On January 18, 1920, the Treaty of Versailles was signed, officially ending the First World War. The treaty was extremely harsh on Germany. They were forced to cede territories, disarm their military and pay reparations for the damage they had caused. This treaty, along with the others that ended the war, were extremely controversial and are considered one of the main causes of the Second World War. So, why did all of this happen? What caused the First World War? Historians have debated this question for decades, and there is no easy answer. Some point to the rise of nationalism as a cause, while others point to imperialism or militarism. Still, others argue that all of these factors combined to create a perfect storm that led to the outbreak of war. Whatever the cause, the effects were devastating. Millions of people were killed, entire generations were wiped out, and the world would never be the same again in the aftermath of the war. The victorious powers divided the German colonies among themselves. This caused resentment among the Germans, who felt that they had been treated unfairly. Many Germans also blamed the Weimar Republic for the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. This resentment and instability would eventually lead to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Hitler would come to power in 1933 and would quickly begin to undo the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. He would rearm Germany, annex Austria and Czechoslovakia, and launch a massive propaganda campaign aimed at winning back German pride. This aggression would eventually lead to the outbreak of the Second World War. So, what can we learn from the First World War? How can we ensure that such a catastrophe never happens again? Perhaps the most important lesson we can learn is that war is never the answer. No matter how strong our feelings may be, no matter how great the provocation, violence is never the answer. We must always strive for peace, understanding and cooperation. If we can do that, then perhaps we can create a better world for ourselves and future generations. This has been the First World War in 100 seconds. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new. If you did, please leave a like and comment below. I'll see you next time.